Hey, well, welcome. My name is Matthew Stiffler-Greasby. I'll be presenting on fighting in the National Hockey League, PE 589, Professional All-Star. This is Spring 2. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with my presentation. Introduction. The purpose of my study was to examine how the NHL players, ex-players, and fans viewed fighting in hockey and if it was beneficial or harmful for the game. So my central research questions to the study were, is it beneficial or harmful for the NHL to allow fighting between players during a game? Does fighting lead to increased injuries? And does fighting lead to a safer game? And so these are all questions that I was interested in researching and finding out, both from a player's perspective, an ex-player's perspective, and also from fans' perspectives. So next slide is faith, values, and beliefs. I am a Christian, and as a Christian, I believe that we should do our most and try our hardest not to fight, and I really discourage fighting. Jesus talks about turning the other cheek in the Gospels, and I believe that is so true as for Christians today to serve one another and not lead into violence. And that violence should be the last resort. However, though, I do believe that as Christians we're called to protect our own and look out for one another, and sometimes that does mean getting in a physical altercation or a fight if that means protecting someone you love out of love. And so my reference is Jesus flipping tables. That was controlled anger. He was angry at what was going on in the temples or at the temple. And so he became angry and had to exert this anger in a way that showed that what the people were doing were wrong. In order to get a point across and to really show not just the people that were doing wrong, but also his followers that, you know what, sometimes it's okay to be angry if it's controlled and if it's just. And so Stu Grimson was an ex-fighter in hockey, and that's what he said. He said it's best, who better to protect someone than a Christian, because they were looking out for their brothers, and he was a Christian NHL enforcer, and he loved what he did because he was able to protect his brothers on his team, and I think that's so true for us as Christians today, that we shouldn't be looking for a fight, but we are called to protect our own and look out for our own, and so I think that could potentially be or could lead us to fighting if it's a just cause. But I think as a Christian, that's something that is a last resort. So hopefully that doesn't contradict myself. Going on to the next slide. First article, Fighting in Hockey Player Perception. And so what was cool about this article, ice hockey players been fighting for years, since the beginning of time, or beginning of the NHL, or beginning of hockey. And this is looking at the fans' perspective of fighting as a major factor of growth over its history. And so the purpose of the study was to determine the different reasons for how players perceive fighting. It interviewed and collected surveys from 144 collegiate level D1 hockey players. And the surveys asked how they perceive fighting and why they participated in fighting. And so the researchers used a cross-sectional based research or survey-based research method. They had Likert scale questions, both short answer or multiple choice, and a little bit of short answers. And this is collected in the northeastern United States, and so it was geared towards that region. So the results for this were thrown through. Many of the players supported fighting, and that it was the most exciting part of a game was to take part in a fight or to watch a fight. The survey also concluded that defensemen specifically looked at fighting as the most beneficial thing that they could do to not only pump up their team, but encourage their teammates and to protect their teammates. And so a lot of defensemen that were interviewed talked about the importance of fighting and how it played a huge role in the game of hockey. And I think the biggest thing that was pulled away from it was 70% of all players believe that it was necessary, or they strongly believe that it was necessary fighting to be part of hockey. So this is important for me and the research I did because it shows players that are in college level that are supporting fighting, that want it to be part of the game and don't want it to be getting rid of. Although it could be dangerous, players want fighting to be a part of the game, and therefore I think it shouldn't be removed, or that was a big proponent for why it should not be removed. We got my second article on penalties in sports as a measure of aggression. Many researchers have conducted studies on players in sports on how they choose or based off of their aggression. But this study focused on evaluating the psychometric properties that each player must choose before taking part in an aggressive act in his or her sport. So this looked at many different sports, but it was really cool because it looked at how a player analyzed and made steps towards an aggressive act. And so there's two authors. They were the only participants. They viewed official records of 505 games from the Western Hockey League, and they looked at 19 main penalties that can be drawn out in the game of hockey, or at least penalized for it and have to serve time in the penalty box. And they watched the aggression of the player who committed the penalty and what led up to it. And it was really cool because this showed this showed the people or the players making the conscious choice of I'm going to go commit a penalty, and it concluded that fighting involves an instigator definitely wanting to inflict harm, and it's definitely an aggressive act. And so the author concludes that the understanding of aggression is a benefit from the use of penalties in dice several ways. And the projected test and research shows that when a player fought, he would receive ample amounts of applause from both teams and fans, and this played a huge role in the fighting. And so even though when a player is choosing cognitively to I'm going to go get into a fight, he knows that he's going to receive applause from both his teammates and his fans, and that encouragement from the teammates and fans prompt players to be more aggressive, to take part in fighting, because they know that they're going to feel the warmth and the love from their team and from their home fans. And so when a player is supported, he feels more inclined to take part in aggressive acts and also to start or also to be involved in a fight. And so this is important for my research because when a player receives this warmth and this love, the aggression level is kicked in. It's also deemed, and they think of, oh, it's going to be okay that I'm going to go do this because I'm going to feel loved. I'm going to feel rewarded. And so, the last one talks about fans loving it. Because fans love it, players are able then to have this psychometric thinking and ability of, if I go commit this penalty, or if I go get in a fight to protect my teammate who I respect because he's on my team, I'm going to feel support from not only him, but the rest of my team and also the fans. So I felt that was very important for me to understand and make a part of my research. Next slide. Results of 1,300 consecutive NHL fights. Fist of Fury with a minimal injuries. This was the most important data I think I found for my research. There's been very few specific studies that have detailed fighting in the National Hockey League. And what was crucial about this was this looked at all fights from the 2010 and 2011 NHL season. And the authors were able to analyze video evidence and watch every single fight from those two seasons, and be able to understand the injuries. And they looked for injuries that were results of the fight. They also had access to team records, both the team's medics and trainers. but also from hospital records. And so they were able to gather all this information and make a detailed graph and a research paper based off of the injuries that they found from these 2 seasons in the NHL. And so they calculated all the injuries from fighting in those 2 seasons. And what was really important is only 17 injuries out of the 710 fights listed in those 2 seasons were staggering or very crucial injuries. And so when you think of 710 fights, only 17 of them really resulting in a big injury, that is definitely makes fighting not seem as deadly and not necessarily aggressive, but a cause for injuries. And so a big proponent or a big thing that the researchers stated was because you're fighting on ice in hockey, you don't have as much traction, and so when you're trying to throw a punch, because you're not grounded with your feet on solid ground and you're on ice and you're twisting, and you're not able to exert enough force to really cause damage to the face or to the chest or to any region that you're trying to strike with your fist, because you don't have enough torque from being on ice. Whereas if you're on land, you're able to really get into it and punch. And so this is great for me to learn and understand. 18% of the injuries were concussions. So again, for the huge concussion scare going on in the United States today and around the world when it comes to sports, when you've got 710 fights, 17 injuries, 18% of those are actual concussions. And it's not just a team medic saying, oh, it's not a concussion, he just had a little headache. But it also, they were able to look at medical records and hospital visits and stuff. Then this really shows that fighting does not play or lead to that many injuries. And so this really was crucial to my learning and understanding for my research. So those are the 3 articles. As we get into the methodologies, first off, I did both a quantitative and qualitative research. My participants, I informed them before I had sent out my my survey a little bit. I gave them a clearance. They signed it so I gave them a little heads up about what was going on. Gave them the clearance, and then they completed the survey, whether it was face-to-face or online. They were able to do that. And then I also conducted a few face-to-face interviews with some ex-hockey players, which was very important and very crucial and definitely led into a lot of information. I conducted the research. I had 50 fans from the ages of 25 to 50 take part in my research. I also had 10 players that were either current or ex-players involved in the research that were able to provide more in-depth personal experiences when it came to fighting in hockey. And this was awesome to hear. I was able to grab demographic details from both fans and players. Being able to record the demographics and see what kind of played a role in their life growing up and what led them to playing hockey. Also where they live, because it's very important to know the demographics of research-based people that are doing the research. So I had asked 15 Likert scale questions and 4 or 5 open-ended questions, 4 to the players and 5 to the fans. These questions were geared at least to the players in hopes of gathering information that came from personal experience that they had both been a part of or seen on the ice while they played. For fans, it was more of their thoughts on what was going on in a fight and if they knew anything particular. Some fans had played in adult leagues or had played hockey growing up, and so some of them had a little bit experience. Now, they weren't in in-depth fights or as powerful fights as what the players had been in, but they had some of the fans had mentioned that they had been in fights in adult leagues in hockey or when they played college hockey, and so this has also played a role in how they answered Likert scale questions, also how they answered their interview questions. The Likert scale questions were geared from strongly agree to disagree, and this was in hopes of getting the opinions of the three main questions, going into more detail about the violence of hockey, the aggression of hockey, and then the safety aspects of hockey. So this was the Likert scale questions. The open-ended questions were asked to find the thoughts and feelings of fighting in hockey, to understand, at least for the players, if there was a code or standard of fighting in hockey that players abided by, and if the players appreciated fighting or scoring. This was also asked to the fans, as if they appreciated watching fighting, or did they prefer scoring and more action in other ways of than fighting in the game. And so this was important for me to find out and learn about, because it helped me with further evidence. My quantitative data analysis methods were employed to analyze the data collection during the study. Frequencies and percentages were calculated on each item on the survey. And then descriptive statistics and themes I'm going to report in my results section. The qualitative data analysis, the written responses for the surveys, I had them transcribed into hard copy. I also had the interviews recorded. I used my cell phone as an audio tape to record the interviews that I did in case I needed extra, or I needed to go back and hear what they had said. So this was able to play a huge role in me understanding and learning and recording the data that I wanted or that I needed for my research. Going to the next slide, results. And so my results, the preliminary analysis, I had 50 fans take part, both male and female. And it was actually really cool. I had 26 females, 23 males, and then one person who did not choose to report their gender. So I had a really good balance between both male and female. I also asked the ages of the other participants, and a good majority of them were about 20. The full range was 20 to 62 years old, with the majority of them from 24 to 34. And I also asked if participants had been a fan of hockey. This ranged from 0 to 50 years, with a majority of it being between 10 and 25 years. For both players and fans, a majority of them reported that they were a white or Caucasian ethnicity, that they grew up in a suburban environment, and that they were part of a middle class growing up. And so growing up middle class, living in a suburban environment, and 98%, a good amount of them reporting that they were white or Caucasian, was an important demographic background for both fans and my players. And so what's cool is these players that participated in it had said they had ranged from playing hockey from 0 to 12 years. 7 of them had played professional for at least 5 years. And so this was great information, and great just personal, like, firsthand accounts that they had brought to the table when it came to my research. My main analysis, right, I wanted to make sure to learn about the benefits of fighting, the drawbacks of fighting, and then safety concerns. And so to investigate the perceived benefits of fighting, I had asked Likert scale questions, were administered And a couple of these questions, I had asked both players and fans if they agreed that there was respect between players who fought, and over 75% of the fans and over 90% of the players agreed that there was respect. I had asked if they believe that fighting was a controlled outlet for aggression, and 70% of my fans and 90% of the players agreed that it was. And they also, that same, about 75 or about 70% fans and 90% players agreed that fighting was a key role to hockey. And this shows me that both fans and players believe that there are benefits to fighting, and that fighting has a vital role in hockey because it's a key role, because it's a controlled outlet for aggression, and because there's respect between players who fight. And I think learning these three things, importantly, does show that that there are benefits to having hockey. So to understand the perceived drawbacks of fighting, I had asked 2 Likert scale questions and then 1 multiple choice question. About 80, more than 80% of my fans and 90% of the players agreed that the NHL should not eliminate fighting. So they did not want fighting to be eliminated. And then more than 70% of fans and 70% of my players said that they strongly wanted to see a fight at the next hockey game they attended or were in. And so even though I was looking for drawbacks, this shows me that because players and fans both wanted to see or partake in a fight in their next game, and that they did not want to eliminate fighting, this showed me that there was not as much of a drawback to fighting as I once thought, or that I thought I would gather. The one drawback that may have come from my questions was my multiple choice question. I had asked, what type of player do most fans like? And most fans had said that they had liked a scorer or a playmaker. They did not like the enforcer type. And so the first 2 questions suggest that there's a positive score signifying that fans and players enjoyed watching or witnessing a fight at professional hockey. That 1 multiple choice question suggests that that fans don't choose to have a fighting player or an enforcer as their favorite player, which I think is very true in any sport, right? Most people don't like the defensemen, they don't like the goalies, or they don't like the centers. They like the ones that do all the scoring, right? Why is Steph Curry, LeBron James, KD the most popular players? Not only because they're the best, but because they score, right? When you think of defensive players, they don't get as big of a rep as do the scorers. So from this information, I feel that there wasn't as much of a drawback to fighting that I once thought, or that a lot of people think about. To understand the safety concerns for fighting, I had asked a couple Likert scale questions. 50% of my fans and 80% of the players believe that fighting was not dangerous. And 80% of players and more than 55% of the fans believe that fighting helped prevent other forms of violence that would take place in the game. And then, this shows me that, especially from the player's perspective, because for this one I wanted to see and gather from a player's perspective the safety concerns, because they're taking part in the action. And when 80% of players believe that it's not dangerous and that fighting actually prevents other violence that happens in the game, I feel that fighting plays a huge role and is important. Because if players feel safer and they feel that they're not gonna, or that there's not gonna be less violence because fighting takes place, then I feel that they're gonna have more of a freedom throughout the game. And it's important to note that the fans that agreed on all the questions for this, when it came to fighting, because my last question was, does fighting make the game safer? 80% of players agreed with it. 35% of fans agreed with it. And so a little bit drop off when it comes to fans, but still the players over 80% agreed that it did make it safer. And so It's important to note, though, that most of the fans that agreed with all the questions had stated that they had watched hockey for more than 5 years, um, and 11 of them had been in a fight in a non-professional hockey game. And I thought that was important to note because those that had experienced either or both watching hockey for a longer period of time or had been experienced being in a fight in a hockey game had agreed that fighting makes the game safer, that it prevented violence. But it was the fans that didn't have that experience or that were newer to the hockey game or newer to the hockey realm. Those are the ones that chose to say that no, like fighting doesn't play a role. Fighting doesn't prevent violence, and fighting doesn't lead to a safer game. So those are some of the results. A couple main themes: cheap shots. This was awesome. In both my interviews with the ex-players, I learned about cheap shots. And they had talked about how an opposing player will likely take a cheap shot or an illegal hit if they feel that there's not going to be repercussions for it. Revenge for a cheap shot, though, is why fighting takes place. It's there to, you know what, look at you, just cheap shot at my best player. I'm going to come after you. And one of the ex-players that I interviewed had said, why does fighting take place? And their answer was to protect your teammates. It shows loyalty, and it shows that you are going to stick up for your teammate. And this is so true, and I think is so relevant to the game of hockey, is when you have fighting, cheap shots are not going to take as much, or not going to happen as much. One of the other articles I had found was on a coach from Montreal, and he had stated this in 2008 when his team, he had one of the highest scoring teams, but in the playoffs they got bounced out early because his two scorers kept on getting hit, kept on being cheap shotted by the other team, and the Montreal didn't have an enforcer on the team, so there was no one that could go and protect their captain, who was the lead scorer, and it totally threw him off his game. And so the coach had said this was the last time he wouldn't have an enforcer on his team, because enforcers are having the players that fight help protect from cheap shots. The second theme I found was policing the game. Fighting is a great thing because it helps police the game. Fighters or enforcers are the police. They make sure no cheap shots happen. They make sure that there's a nice ebb and flow to the game. That they're going to stand up for those that can't defend themselves. Right. The more shifty and fast-paced players generally aren't the biggest ones. So when they get hit, they cannot go after the player that hit them because they're a lot smaller, usually less strong. Where the enforcer comes in because he can stand up for his teammates. And so when another team knows that, oh, there's an enforcer on this team that, you know, he's known for fighting, and he'll come after me if I go after his player, they usually back off. So it prevents cheap shots, and it also shows that enforcers help police the game. Fighting code was also a theme that it was cool to learn from the actual players themselves. They had talked about there's a code to fighting that you couldn't fight if the other player didn't want to. So generally, if you go up and you start to tussle with the guy, if the other guy says, no, dude, I'm not going to fight, then usually the fight does not happen. Only two players can take part in the fight. There's not supposed to be a third party. No cheap shots. Generally, you fight your size and your weight. Now, the players are saying that this generally is the rule, but however, there are some times where it doesn't happen. Just like in life, there's going to be unexpected curveballs, but for the most part, you try to fight a person your own size, your own weight, so that it's an even fight. And it was cool because this isn't something that a lot of the media or the sports channels talk about, but hearing this from the players was great. And they said that the fighting is all about respect, that generally the player knows if he's done something wrong, so the enforcer from the other team is going to come after him. And so um, having these code or this unwritten rule is floats around the different locker rooms, and every player knows that, hey, if I cheap shot or if I hit a player, illegally or in a cheap shot style or a way, there are going to be repercussions of it, and that I think is super important to the game. Um, and so we've got the code, and then also just a key rule. So many of the fans and the players were just talking about how hockey plays a key role. Sorry, how fighting plays a key role in hockey. And so there are cheap shots that are going to happen. The game is super fast paced, but fighting helps limit those. It helps protect players, helps keep the game safe, and it helps lead to a safer game because players aren't going to be cheap shotting as much or trying to get away with slide penalties or slide checks. The fans love it, and so they're going to continue to pour out and come out to the games to watch fighting take place. And I thought this was important. One of the ex-players had talked about these playoffs that just happened, and in the second round, Sidney Crosby, arguably the best player in the NHL, got checked in the back of the neck, and had an enforcer on the Penguins been there on the ice or had shown throughout the series earlier in the last couple games his presence and that they should not be going after Sidney Crosby, the ex-player that I had talked to believed that Sidney Crosby wouldn't have been hit and wouldn't have had to miss a game because throughout the series he was getting checked, but there wasn't an enforcer type on the Penguins that would stick up for Sidney and protect him. And so I thought this was cool because he was applying it to literally what happened 3 weeks ago. So next slide is my discussion. Like I was saying earlier, there's not many research or not many articles or scholar research is done on fighting, and so I think that first and foremost there needs to be more. It's important. It was important to do this investigation for both fans and players' standpoint to better understand how they feel about fighting and how they would feel if fighting in fact or did get eliminated from the game. I was able to measure the feelings of the fans and the players by distributing the surveys and seeing what how they reacted to the different questions. 70% of the fans and more than 90% of the current and former players believe that there was respect between the players who fought and that it played a significant role. And so this actually corresponded to one of the articles I had found, some of the research done earlier in 2013. There's 3 authors that had investigated fans and how they would attend games and what drew them to games. Was it fighting? Was it low ticket sales? Was it low food cost? Or was it like bobblehead nights and free giveaways? And a majority of the fans that they had interviewed had said they come to a fight, they come to a hockey game to watch a fight because they want to see a fight take place. And they had also, in their data, had said that a home game following a fight usually had more of a turnout. So if there's back-to-back home games, in the first home game, if there's a fight in it, the next home game for that team, there'd be more fans in attendance because they had heard or they had read about a fight being in the previous game, and so they're more likely to come out the next game. So there's not many drawbacks I found overall through this. The research, even though I had tried to find different drawbacks because of how the players and the fans reported that they had wanted to see a game or wanted to see a fight in a game, the questions that were geared to helped me understand the drawbacks kind of backfired and kind of showed me that there wasn't drawbacks, that it was more of a positive light. And so not only did it benefit the game, there was less drawbacks. So even though there's several accusations out there saying that fighting is bad, especially on a safety level, right? One researcher had said that there's the repeated head trauma that can come from hockey contributes to severe brain damage. And although that is true, I think in most sports and in daily life, if I continue to get a repeated blow to the head, yes, it's gonna affect me. But because when it comes to fighting, as I saw and as I talked to you about in the one article and that one research, because they're throwing punches on ice, they're not landing as much and they're not having as much power behind them because they can't generate the torque needed if a person was standing on his 2 feet on the ground that could generate. So even though there's been few published investigations on drawbacks, I had found that 84% of fans and 90% of former and current players did not want to see the NHL eliminate fighting. So this would contradict what that one author had talked about, where repeated trauma would prevent damage and that it would lead to more people not wanting to watch it. And so this author was Kale. He believed that more would watch a game if fighting was removed. However, from the data I gathered, I think that this is opposite. There isn't a drawback to fighting. I think more players and more fans want to watch it. There's a niche in the hockey culture. They want to see this aggression. They want to see fighting remain in hockey. And even though there might be some safety concerns, I think because the limited injuries from fighting, especially seen in that 2010-2011 research, that there's more injuries caused from normal plays, like everyday play on the ice, than from fighting. So safety isn't a big concern when it comes to those fighting. My last slide, recommendations, implications, and future research. I'm going to start with implications. I think first and foremost, the implications that came from this are educating. I think people need to be educated when it comes to knowing about fighting and learning about fighting in hockey. It does, it might look violent and brutal, but it's a huge benefit to the game. There's not that many drawbacks, and the safety concerns from it, there's not that many. Injuries are way down compared to everyday play in hockey and compared to other sports. And so concussions, there's not that many that happen from fighting, even though people think repeated blows to the head might cause it. Because they're on ice and they're not generating enough power, concussions have been down in hockey. And so educating people on what happens, or the basics of safety in fighting in hockey, is very important. I would also implications for professional players, because they're in game. First off, you need to know that fighting can happen in your game, and understand that other players might want to fight against you if you cheap shot or if you cause problems or pain to another player. But also understand that most players are looking to fight someone with your own strength and size and weight and size. And so if you do happen to find yourself in a fight, at least it should be at least a fair fight because you're fighting against someone your own size. But if you don't commit a bad penalty, you're not going to be targeted by an opposing enforcer. For young players, fighting is outlawed up until the minors, and even in the minors, you get a 5-minute penalty, just like in professional. And so for young players, don't worry about fighting. It's not part of the game. Perfect other aspects of your game: passing, shooting, scoring, dribbling the puck, work on your skating and your speed. You don't need to practice fighting or be involved in fighting because it's not allowed. Recommendations. My recommendations for PE teachers and coaches: continue to do more research on hockey. Um, teach your students or your players that fighting is not allowed at their age, and that they, like I was saying to the players, perfect their game, learn the brilliance and the creativity of hockey when it comes to stick handling, shooting, and passing. And so PE teachers and coaches, don't, I think, educate your players and your students that fighting doesn't happen, and then help them see the importance of why fighting does happen in the game. It is to protect players, show them the benefits of that, educate them on, there's not that many injuries from it, but however, it is a penalty in the majors, and that's where it's allowed. And so I think teaching the kids and the students about this is very important. Future research that needs to be done. I think most fans that were part of this survey lived in Southern California, and so even though it's a great area to live, it's not a huge hockey town, and so I think if the NHL could do this, conduct a fan survey nationwide or even worldwide. Canada is huge, Europe is very huge in hockey, the Northern Hemisphere. Getting a national or an international poll could definitely contribute further information to this research of how fans perceive fighting in hockey. And I think more research needs to be carried out on safety, the safety of fighting, and also how more studies should be done on the outcomes of these injuries. And so not only looking at the injuries and the safety precautions that need to go into fighting, both pre-fight and then after fight, but also the injuries that occur from it. And I think this should be done every year by the NHL. I think they need to put together a team to watch all injuries, and then especially those from fighting. NHL should look into doing this. I think this will help spread the information of why hockey allows fighting and why fighting is beneficial, because I believe that the injury levels don't really connect, or the vast amount of injuries from hockey aren't related to fighting. And I think if the main culture media and those that don't really watch fighting, when they hear about that and they learn about that, they're going to be more open to not criticizing why hockey allows fighting. And so I think future research needs to be done both on players and safety. And it's always fun to get a fan's opinion. So encouraging more of a national or international poll on fans and how they feel about fighting. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation on fighting in the NHL. I had so much fun learning and diving into this, and especially interviewing the ex and current players and how they felt about fighting. Hope you guys have a wonderful day. Guys, we're almost done. All right. Have a wonderful night.